Picture this: 9 knights, dusty from months of travel, standing before the crumbling walls of Jerusalem in the year 1119. The air thick with incense and ambition. These weren't your typical crusaders hungry for gold or glory. They claimed a simple mission: protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to the Holy Land. But here's what doesn't add up. Within months of their arrival, they weren't patrolling roads or escorting travelers. Instead, they were digging. Deep beneath the Temple Mount, in chambers that hadn't seen light for 1,000 years. What were they really looking for? And more importantly, what did they find? You've heard fragments of this story before. The Knights Templar, those warrior monks who became medieval Europe's first international banking empire. Their rise was meteoric, their fall spectacular, and their secrets legendary. But what if I told you that buried beneath centuries of myth and speculation lies something far more dangerous than lost treasure or ancient relics? What if they discovered a name so powerful, so threatening to the very foundations of Christianity, that it had to be erased from history itself? Today we're going deep into one of the most carefully guarded mysteries in human history, a discovery that would shake the church to its core and rewrite everything you thought you knew about the origins of faith itself. This isn't just about medieval knights or dusty manuscripts. This is about truth, power, and the length some will go to keep certain words from ever being spoken. Before we dive deeper, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because you're about to discover secrets that took me months of research to uncover. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why some knowledge was never meant to see daylight. Let's start with what we know for certain. In 1119, 9 French knights approached King Baldwin of Jerusalem with an unusual request. They wanted permission to establish a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims. Sounds noble, right? The king granted them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built directly on top of what tradition claims was Solomon's temple. This location wasn't random, it was strategic. But here's where the official story starts to crack. For the first 9 years of their existence, the Templars recruited almost no new members. 9 knights protecting thousands of pilgrims across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. The math doesn't work. What's more, there are virtually no records of them actually protecting anyone during this period. So, what were they really doing? Archaeological evidence suggests they spent those early years excavating, not building, not fortifying, but digging systematically beneath the Temple Mount. Local accounts from the period describe strange sounds echoing from underground chambers at night. Tools scraping against stone. Voices whispering in languages that hadn't been heard for centuries. Then something changed. Around 1128, the Templars emerged from their underground work transformed. Suddenly, they were recruiting aggressively across Europe. Nobles donated vast estates to their cause. The Pope himself granted them unprecedented privileges, exempting them from local laws and making them answerable only to Rome. Within decades, they controlled a network of castles, farms, and financial institutions that stretched from Portugal to the Holy Land. This kind of power doesn't just happen overnight. It requires leverage, something valuable enough to command respect from kings and popes alike. But what could 9 relatively unknown knights have discovered that would grant them such extraordinary influence? The answer might lie in what they brought back from Jerusalem. Historical records show that after their initial excavation period, the Templars began transporting mysterious cargo from the Holy Land to their strongholds in France. Heavy chests that required multiple guards and travelled only under cover of darkness. Contents never officially declared. Destinations always the most secure vaults in their most fortified locations. One particularly intriguing account comes from a monk named Hugh of Paynes, writing in 1131. He describes seeing Templar knights unloading stone tablets covered in script he couldn't identify. The writing, he noted, appeared to be a mixture of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. More disturbing to the monk was the reaction of his fellow clergy when they glimpsed these artifacts. Several crossed themselves and hurried away, muttering prayers of protection. What kind of text could inspire such fear in men of God? To understand the significance, we need to grasp what the Temple Mount represented in the 12th century. This wasn't just any archaeological site. According to Jewish tradition, it housed the Holy of Holies, the most sacred chamber in Solomon's temple. This was where the Ark of the Covenant supposedly rested, where only the high priest could enter, and only once a year. If any first-century artifacts survived the temple's destruction in 70 AD, this is where they would be. But the Templars weren't just looking for relics. Evidence suggests they were searching for something specific. Medieval chroniclers describe how they focused their excavations on particular sections of the underground chambers, as if following a map or set of instructions. They knew exactly where to dig. This precision suggests they possessed prior knowledge about what lay beneath the temple, knowledge that could only have come from extremely old sources, documents or oral traditions that had somehow survived the centuries of conquest, destruction, and religious upheaval that had swept through Jerusalem. What they found would explain everything that came after: the sudden wealth, the papal privileges, the network of secret strongholds across Europe. But it would also explain something else: the Church's increasingly nervous relationship with the order as the decades passed. You see, by the late 1200s, Church authorities were growing uncomfortable with Templar independence. These knights had become too powerful, too secretive, too removed from direct ecclesiastical control. Rumours began circulating about strange rituals, heretical beliefs, and blasphemous practices within their ranks. But what if these weren't just rumours? What if the Templars had indeed discovered something that challenged fundamental church doctrine? Something so threatening that it had to be suppressed, even if it meant destroying the entire order? The persecution that followed would be swift and brutal. On Friday the 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France, acting in coordination with Pope Clement V, ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in the kingdom. The charges were spectacular: heresy, blasphemy, worship of false idols, and denial of Christ. Under torture, some Templars confessed to these crimes, but their confessions contained curious details that historians still debate today. They spoke of venerating a severed head, of denying the crucifixion, of secret knowledge passed down through their leadership. Most intriguingly, several mentioned a name that their interrogators seemed desperate to hear, yet terrified to record. The transcripts of these trials, preserved in Vatican archives, show clear evidence of redaction. Entire passages have been deliberately obscured or removed. In several cases, testimony appears to have been stopped mid-sentence when certain topics arose. What were these medieval inquisitors so afraid of documenting? The answer might lie in fragments that survived the purge. Hidden in monastery libraries across Europe, tucked away in family archives, encoded in architectural details that most would dismiss as mere decoration, these remnants tell a story the Church desperately wanted erased. In 1348, a Franciscan monk named Brother Thomas of Aquino discovered something extraordinary while cataloguing manuscripts in a remote abbey near the Pyrenees. Hidden within the binding of a psalter, he found 3 pieces of parchment covered in symbols and text. The writing was clearly Templar, identifiable by distinctive flourishes used nowhere else in medieval script. But it was the content that made Brother Thomas seal these fragments away for the rest of his life. His journal, discovered only in 1892, describes his horror at what he read. The parchments spoke of a discovery beneath Jerusalem that challenged everything he believed about Christian origins. They mentioned a tomb, not empty as scripture claimed, but containing evidence of something the monk could barely bring himself to write about: a bloodline, a continuation, a truth that would shatter the foundations of papal authority. Brother Thomas burned 2 of the 3 fragments that very night, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy the 3rd. Instead, he hid it in the abbey's foundation stones, where it remained until the monastery's demolition 6 centuries later. The recovered fragment contains only a partial text, but what survives is electrifying. It speaks of the true heir and the sacred union, and references a name written in what appears to be Aramaic. The name itself is partially damaged, but linguistic analysis suggests it begins with the letters that would spell Miriam in the ancient tongue, the Hebrew form of Mary. But not Mary, the mother of Jesus. The fragment makes clear this is someone else entirely, someone whose very existence threatened everything the early church had built. This discovery takes on even greater significance when we examine Templar behavior during their final years. As pressure from Rome intensified, the order didn't just hide their treasure. They systematically destroyed documents, burned libraries, melted down artifacts. It was as if they were trying to erase not just evidence of their wealth, but evidence of their knowledge itself. Yet they preserved certain things, encoded them in ways that would survive even if the order didn't. Take Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by the Sinclair family who had close ties to fleeing Templars. The chapel's carvings include botanical specimens from the Americas, decades before Columbus sailed. But more intriguingly, they include symbols that match nothing in conventional Christian iconography. Angels playing unusual instruments, figures in poses that mirror ancient fertility rites. And throughout it all, recurring motifs that seem to tell a story in stone. That story becomes clearer when you understand what the Templars really brought back from Jerusalem. It wasn't gold or silver or precious stones. It was information, documentation of something that had been carefully hidden since the earliest days of Christianity. Evidence that the official version of events, the version that granted Rome its authority over the faithful, wasn't the complete truth. The name they found carved in those underground chambers wasn't just any name. It was the name of someone who should have been central to Christian history, but had been systematically erased from it. Someone whose very existence would have shifted power away from Rome and toward a very different understanding of divine authority. Consider how the early church fathers struggled with certain questions. Why were there so many competing gospels in the first centuries after Christ's death? Why did some early Christian communities worship differently, emphasize different teachings, follow different leaders? The official answer is that these were heresies, deviations from true doctrine. But what if they weren't deviations at all? What if they were preserving an older, more complete truth? The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 offer tantalizing glimpses of what that truth might have been. They speak of Mary Magdalene not as a reformed sinner, but as Jesus' closest companion and most trusted disciple. They describe her receiving secret teachings, special knowledge, a role that the male apostles resented and ultimately suppressed. But even these texts don't tell the complete story. They hint at something more, something that would explain why the Templars became so powerful so quickly after their Jerusalem excavations. Something that would justify the church's desperate efforts to destroy them completely. The key lies in understanding what the Temple Mount represented beyond its religious significance. It was a repository, a place where the most sacred and dangerous knowledge of ancient Judaism would have been preserved, including records that the early Christian church had every reason to want buried forever. Records of what really happened in those crucial decades after the crucifixion, who carried on Jesus' teachings, how the early communities were organized, what they believed about divine authority and spiritual succession, and most dangerous of all, whether the line of spiritual inheritance ended with Christ's death or continued through someone the church had written out of history entirely. This is why the Templars had to be destroyed so completely. It wasn't enough to seize their wealth or break their power. The knowledge they possessed threatened the very legitimacy of papal authority. If that knowledge had become public, if that name had been spoken openly, It would have transformed Christianity itself. But destroying the Templars didn't destroy what they had learned. It scattered that knowledge, drove it underground, forced it into symbols and codes and whispered traditions that would survive even the most thorough persecution. And sometimes, if you know where to look and how to read the signs, you can still find traces of that forbidden name echoing through the centuries. Waiting in carved stone, and hidden manuscripts and architectural anomalies that make no sense unless you understand what they're really trying to preserve. The question isn't whether this name exists. The question is whether we're ready to hear it. So here we stand, at the edge of one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. 9 knights entered Jerusalem seeking pilgrims to protect, but they left with something far more dangerous than gold or relics. They discovered a name that could rewrite everything we think we know about the foundations of faith itself. The evidence is scattered across centuries like breadcrumbs in a forest, stone tablets that made monks cross themselves in fear, trial transcripts with passages deliberately obscured, architectural mysteries that encode truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Each fragment points to the same conclusion. The Templars found something beneath that ancient temple that the church would kill to keep buried. Whether that name was Mary Magdalene, whether it pointed to a bloodline that continued past the crucifixion, whether it revealed spiritual authority that bypassed Rome entirely, we may never know for certain. But we know this: it was powerful enough to transform 9 unknown knights into medieval Europe's most influential order, and threatening enough that the church was willing to destroy them completely rather than risk that knowledge becoming public. The truth has a way of surviving, even when empires try to bury it. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look past the official story and ask the questions that make power tremble. That forbidden name is still out there, echoing through the centuries. The only question is whether you're ready to hear it whispered in the shadows, where truth goes to survive.